Salam and peace. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. We're always there on Galaxy 19 satellite and muslimnetwork.tv, but also on Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and pretty soon on Apple TV as well. You can find us on our social media if you like. The world is moving forward, and sometimes I feel that there is more truth coming on our way. I hope our capacity to handle with truth also increases. One can be a prisoner of history, or history can liberate you. It depends on your intentions. It also depends on through who you are. It depends on how truthful you like to be. I never personally forget how, in a family setting, someone used a slur to describe my mother in front of me, being a child, as an untouchable, daughter of an untouchable. That stayed with me, and that guided me towards research about who my mother is, who untouchables are. And I kept exploring, and my exploration led me to write an award-winning textbook in America, which I attributed to my maternal grandmother because it was her memory which sparked that research. Being an immigrant, you continue to learn about your adopted country. I'm not an economic immigrant, or I didn't come here for money. I actually had a better car and a better house and all the loved ones and a whole lot of other things going for me. But I was frustrated. I was looking for more justice, more democracy, and I was somewhat impatient, I would say. So I read constitutions of the world. And I'm just happy that I read the amended Constitution of America, not the earlier versions of it. That brought me here. But as soon as I landed, my education began, and I read a whole lot of things and got involved in the peace justice movement. I also learned that, justice doesn't seem to be something static. It's not an apple which you got hold of, you purchased, or you plucked from your garden and you ate it and you're enjoying, and rest of your life you live in justice. Same thing probably cannot be said about democracy. In my faith, Islam, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has said the faith doesn't stay at one level. You invest in it, it increases. You forget about it, and it goes down. So I feel the same thing about democracy and justice. It requires a struggle and sacrifice, and each generation contribute to that. And for this reason, these things attract me. And one of the things I didn't know about my adopted country, where now I have spent most of my adult life, is the slavery in the North. And I read this fascinating article in Washington Post. Well, one of the things about pandemic is that I have started subscribing to newspaper and paying for what services I get. So Washington Post article I read, it was about uncovering one's ancestors who were slave owners, and that giving her a shock, and she started exploring the truth. And that truth exploration led me to her. And that article was by Debra Bruno. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Debra.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Debra Bruno is a longtime journalist who, for some reason, writes only for Washington papers, Washington Post, Washington Magazine, and Washington Lawyer. Although she is from Hudson Valley, New York, but Washington seems to fascinate her. Her interest includes health and science, culture, travel, and history. A recent article in Washington Post has caused many readers to examine their own ancestry and the history of slavery And for this immigrant, it has involved the history of its adopted country. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be on our show.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about it. I love talking about it.
All right. You just don't seems to love talking about it. You seems to love researching very thoroughly as well.
The research has been fascinating. It really is like digging deep and deep and jumping into a rabbit hole. And then once you jump down that rabbit hole, you find more and more, and it's very hard to stop. It's very hard to stop. I'm especially fascinated by sort of looking at old census records, at old last wills and testaments. There are ways that you can learn bits and pieces about people from the past that these days it's become easier and easier to do that these days. So that's part of what I've been doing.
It seems that looking at your article and the comments below that, it seems you have started a movement and people are coming out in some ways.
Yeah, well, what surprised me actually was that when I started doing the research, what I learned was that even very well educated, very well read Americans really didn't know anything about slavery in the North and in New York State. And it's been changing to some extent. In other words, New York City has done a pretty good job of exploring its own past in terms of slavery. But upstate New York, the Hudson Valley, which is where I grew up, has been a little bit slower in kind of coming to terms with that. And so I remember years ago telling a friend who was a historian who had written a book about slavery that I was very interested in looking at my Dutch ancestry. And she said, well, they were probably slave owners. And I said, no, 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 no. My
Oh,
family,
just like that is straight answer.
she said they were, and she was correct. But what happened was I denied it in the beginning because I said, no, we were poor. We were farmers. We didn't have any money. We never came from much. And so how could we have slaves? And I think I was imagining the giant plantations of the South with hundreds of people enslaved. And then it wasn't until years later when I had the time to actually do the research that I found this. The first one I found was the last will and testament of my 5 times great grandfather, Isaac Collier, who was bequeathing very carefully his horse, his feather bed, and then his Negro boy Will and his Negro wench Marie to his various descendants. And it was really like a punch to the stomach. I was that shocked and that horrified because Collier, his name was my grandmother's maiden name. So this was very close to home. And at that point, I just dug into the research and couldn't stop myself. I couldn't stop, looking and looking.
And when was that? When it began like that?
That was about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer.
Hmm.
I've been doing this pretty much nonstop for a couple of years, so it's been really a passion.
So tell me, let's 101 about the Hudson Valley. How far is it from the New York City? Because most immigrants don't know New York City where it is. They don't know how far it goes.
Right. Well, the Hudson Valley, my town is about 2 hours north by car from New York City and about an hour south of Albany. So it's sort of midway between Albany, the capital, and the city. But still a fairly rural area. It's still not highly developed. These days, of course, New Yorkers are finding vacation homes and second homes up in that area, but generally it's a pretty quiet area and never had great population, which is why I thought that slavery didn't touch us. It didn't have anything to do with us. So that's why I was shocked.
So slavery, you mentioned in your article that slavery was there in New York for 200 years. Was it focused on the Hudson Valley or it was all around?
Well, the New York City was one of the giant areas that had slavery, and the percentages were pretty high there. The Hudson Valley, because this is where the early settlers started, some in the Mohawk Valley, so the Mohawk River goes west from the Hudson, and then some in the farms and the Catskills, anywhere where people would need the labor. But generally, in upstate New York, it was centered around Albany, the capital, and then the Hudson Valley. So that's where most of the slaves were kept.
So so the general knowledge that slavery is the great white north who is so great and so liberal, that they thought the slavery in the south is bad and they need to do something historic by liberating them, uh, is just a myth.
No, it's not a myth. I mean, the North had a huge role in ending slavery. I mean, the North fought, for the Union and did, sacrifice many, thousands and thousands of men in the Civil War. And New York State was very big on the Underground Railroad. So those things are certainly true. But unfortunately, that positive fact has kind of superseded all other facts. So that kind of overwhelms the narrative. That narrative exists, but on top of that narrative is a narrative of slavery where before, especially before the American Revolution and during and just after the American Revolution, many, many New Yorkers were doing everything they could not to give up their slaves. And as a result, New York State had a 30-year period of what I call the twilight period of slavery, where they slow rolled slavery. They did a slow, gradual emancipation so that a child could be born after July 4th, 1799, which was the official end of slavery. That child could be born and live the first 25 to 27 years of his or her life as an indentured servant, bought and sold as if they were slaves, and treated pretty much the same as a slave would have been treated. And then finally would be emancipated. And the age kept changing, but it was around the age of 25. And then they would be free. But it was a slow process. And if you were born before that date, you weren't emancipated until 1827. So that was a very long time to be living in slavery, even though technically slavery was ended.
So was New York at that time a hub of liberal thoughts? How was New York at that time?
I think there were two factions: the abolitionist faction and the anti-abolitionist faction. And the anti-abolitionist faction was fairly strong. Abolitionists were at great risk a lot of times to sort of fight. And of course, there was the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that you were required, if you knew that there was a fugitive slave, you were required to turn them in by law. So there were a lot of legal reasons why people would either look the other way or aid in kidnapping escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. So there were two factions, and so it was a real kind of stronger battle, I think, than people realized. The other thing that's interesting about slavery in New York is that people felt that because it was of smaller scale, it was more benign in some ways. And it's certainly true that many of the enslaved people lived in the homes of their owners, or they lived in the attic or the cellar. It wasn't necessarily comfortable, but it may not have been as harsh in some levels. But slavery is slavery. I don't think there's any denying that owning a human being there's no other way around it but to say that is slavery and that is not a good thing.
Title of your article includes a subtitle which says, "Would connecting with a descendant of those who were enslaved bring anyone healing?" with a question mark. How do you feel about it now?
Well, I feel as if it was a great gift to connect to this woman, Eleanor Meyer, who has become a friend, and we are genealogy detectives together. We text and email constantly, and we're always uncovering little tidbits. And we're mostly focusing on her family because her family is so fascinating. So it was just this wonderful serendipitous moment where I put a call out to a Facebook site called "I've Traced My Enslaved Ancestors and Their Owners." And you had to be invited to join the group, and you have to be respectful in the group. But I just put out a very vague call for anyone who had any information, saying I was descended from enslavers in the Hudson Valley. And that's all I said, Hudson Valley, very vaguely. And within 24 hours, I received an email from Eleanor who said, I'm descended from slaves in Coxsackie, New Baltimore. And that was just, it was just shocking because I had not said the town, and that was exactly the town I was looking at. And so it turned out that her ancestors were connected with mine. My ancestors owned her ancestors. And I said, well, I feel terrible about that. And her response was, you shouldn't feel terrible. This wasn't you. This was your ancestors. She said, if you had excuses for slavery today, if you didn't think it was that bad, I might have a problem. But if you're just an investigator like me, let's do this together. And that's pretty much been our attitude ever since then. And it's been a wonderful exploration. I enjoy trading information with her every day.
That particular response, I especially read couple of times. Isn't this great to meet a great human being?
She's a wonderful human being and really interested in all of this. So she was lucky as well because she had a distant relative. I think she was the wife of a distant cousin who got very excited about genealogy and years ago did a lot of research. So she had this information for a few years, but she didn't really know what to do with it. And so we kind of put the two things together and added it up to doing more on that. So that was wonderful. And it also was wonderful that we were able to visit the grave of her ancestor, Mary Vanderzee, who was this remarkable woman. And we could pay our respects at the very site where she was buried, which was just a wonderful experience as well.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Debra Bruno, who has written a fascinating history, a journey in the world of truth. Not easy, but liberating. We'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah, let's explore.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Debra Bruno, who has written an article in Washington Post about the research which she has done in many areas. One area, of course, is figuring out exactly the truth about her ancestors, if they were slave owners. Yes, they were. And who were these slaves? And she discovered them and developed relationship, which is ongoing. And the third area of questions she has raised about why the slavery in North is not part of a common knowledge in the United States. I mean, if you have ongoing research and ongoing relationship, of course, you got text messages which may get accidentally deleted. You have email exchanges. But one component of people knowing anything about what's happening is video. Are you video recording this giant research and conversation? Because I like to see it to become a documentary of some sort. So because your purpose is education. Wasn't that the article on Washington Post have something about a history lesson or something?
Yes, history lessons. That's true. Well, you know, I did there. That is definitely a possibility. I've been talking to a few people about that. So stand by for that. More information there. We'll see.
Yeah, that is going to be extremely important to keep recording what is happening, whatever happened, but that those exchanges, those things cannot be reenacted as a drama, because this is not a drama. This is a thorough research and learning which is taking place together. So I'm glad that you're keeping an eye on that. Deborah, tell us what type of feedback are you getting from people? I mean, of course, there are hundreds of comments below your article, but people are approaching you as well. What type are these? How you define the reaction to this?
Well, I think for the vast majority have been positive. You know, you do get the occasional people who argue, oh, why are we talking about this now? This is the past, and you shouldn't care about what your ancestors did, and this has nothing to do with today. But I think for the most part, most people have had a couple of different reactions to the article. One is, I had no idea this was true, and I thought I knew a lot of history. People who've written to me and said, I was a history major, I love history, I still didn't know this. I've had people write to me and say, I'm also of Dutch ancestry, I didn't know this about my ancestry, I'm going to go look into this right now. I've had people who say, I just love the story of the friendship between me and Eleanor, and I hope that that continues. So I think that there have been mostly wonderful and positive and very encouraging reactions to it. It's really given me hope that I can continue to do more writing on this and to do more research on this, because this is really in lots of ways the tip of the iceberg, just the very beginning of what I think I'll be able to find out.
I would like to quote something and hear your reaction to that. You write that growing up in the North, I would rarely thought about slavery, and the civil rights struggle of the 1960s seems as distant as moon landing. But suddenly slavery was as real as the rolling hills beside the Hudson River that flowed past my parents' home. Why do you think slave ownership of the North remained hidden for so long?
I don't really know for sure why. I do think that it was counter to the narrative of the North as the good guys. The North was the saviors of, slaves, and, ended, and New York State did end slavery without a war. So there is something positive about that, of course. But at the same time, I think that it just didn't fit into the positive narrative that we have in this country. As you know, we love a strong, positive narrative of good guys winning over the bad guys. So I think that narrative overwhelmed the older stories.
Yeah, and that narrative also goes so deep in human beings. Tribals fascinated about the tribal heroes, and when nation state came into being, it started building its own myths and heroes and partial history, and not confronting all of that. Nation state, I was looking at Karen Armstrong's book. The nation state seems to have killed more people than rest of the humanity. World War I, World War II, all part of that. So history is just, you're just helping write a different type of narrative. But you see, in your elementary school, not even high school, these things were taught.
Well, keep in mind that I'm 63 years old, so I'm not so young. And
Let the record show I didn't ask your age.
well, that's okay. I'm not ashamed of it. But what I was going to say is, the civil rights movement was really sort of happening at the time that I was growing up, but the textbooks weren't really changing at the same time. So I didn't really have a strong civil rights education, even though it was happening around me at the time. In other words, the schools didn't focus on Black lives at all, really. I learned a lot of this on my own. I read quite a bit, especially in high school and in college, because that was something that interested me. But it was a slow progress. So did I learn about the Civil War? Yes, but just really kind of very generally, and so I think that this was enough of a subset of education that I could see how it could be skipped over to that extent also. But I've heard since my article came out from some teachers in upstate New York and who have showed me some of their curriculum, some of their pages from their textbooks. And it is included. It's not a big part, but it is definitely included in the textbooks today. So I think that there is progress being made, but I didn't have it.
Yeah, I was assuming that because, when I see how sincerely and how boldly non-Blacks are participating in Black Lives Matter protest, and sometimes in some places they are the only one, the dominant. So I was thinking there is something in educational process which resonates with the social media information. Of course, when you see somebody's knees until that guy, George Floyd, leaves this world. I mean, that itself is enough education, but it is connecting to some prior knowledge that people are, that is sort of becoming a last straw of information, which is helping people come forward and march and react. So educational system and textbooks probably revised. I wish it could be that good for other narrative, which sort of hurts other people, like as a Muslim community member. I mean, a lot of Islamophobia is coming from the textbooks. 25% of the people in the school system who are Islamophobic actually are teachers, according to surveys. So some Dalit people, because my ancestry partially is with untouchables of India, they were looking into the textbooks in California, in which there was some mention of caste, and some Brahman high caste people were trying that to be eliminated from it. And they engaged some Muslim community whose history was also being mismanaged. And I saw there is a huge politics behind what gets into the textbooks, but there seems to be a positive trends. I hope those trends will make our generation more informed, better informed, and moving forward with the truth instead of absence of it. Where there were slave owners, were there slave owners, you think, who thought they were engaged in sin? Because you write, about your ancestors. Here was a man, who otherwise seems to be very diligent about how he was dealing, except he has no idea about the sins. The word sin which you use, there were some preacher at that time who will describe this as a sin for people? Because most of the preachers who are controlling religion in some ways.
I think it depends on the group. I think the Dutch Reformed Church didn't necessarily see slavery as a sin at the time, and many of my ancestors belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. They did welcome their slaves into the church after a certain point and baptize them in the church, but they didn't necessarily equate baptism with emancipation. So that was the other complicated thing. Of course, you have Quakers, and Quakers very early on got rid of their whole system of slavery. So yes, there were groups who were very anti-slavery, But many people would quote from the Bible saying slavery was in the Bible, so therefore it must be justified. And so they would actually use religious texts to support the idea of slavery. I honestly think that they didn't necessarily have the concept of seeing it as wrong, because I can't reconcile how you could say you're imagining your reception into the arms of God, and oh, by the way, my daughter can have this slave and my son can have that slave, and treat human beings as if they were part of their property. It's just very hard for me to reconcile that in my mind.
Well, as a Muslim, I must tell you that I ended up writing a article about slavery and how Islam dealt with it, because ISIS was trying to revive slavery using some ancient text without realizing that how big of a movement it was against the slavery itself. So the people, always, come up in our time and age. And I was surprised when President Carter, I was present there when he said, I forgot, what is the number? He said, then in Atlanta, how many slaves are, how many people are sold right now per day into some type of human trafficking system, which end up, so human beings are always, one or the other way, control of human being taken to the level which has become slavery. Whether it has a name slavery or not is a different perspective.
Right.
You're watching network TV. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say human trafficking is the same thing, really. Yes.
Yeah. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, muslimnetwork.tv, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and we'll be right back after these messages.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilize thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to over $600 million. 2 of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, A Slow-Burning Genocide, on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tell of Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast from China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Debra. Debra, comments are interesting below your article, and a learning experience. I see echo of the debate which is going around in our country around the Black Lives Matter. So one of the I will quote a small portion. There is no question that African American have the worst narrative, but virtually no one in the US had a good one. We're all from the background of poverty and oppression, one way or the other.
Well, this is true. I mean, my grandfather, my Italian grandfather.
Give me a little short more. The percentage of Americans in the present day who have any involvement in slavery is probably a fraction of 1%, unquote.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I missed it.
Yeah, and the same quote also goes on saying the percentage of Americans in the present day who have any involvement in slavery is probably a fraction of 1%.
In the present day, yes. I mean, I think it's more the legacy of slavery, the legacy of this oppression that has lingered in the United States, that if we don't come to terms with our past, it's very hard to figure out how we are going to proceed in the future or in the present day, because we are not acknowledging some of the things that happened. And by not acknowledging it, it's not giving it the attention that it deserves, and it doesn't allow people to sort of think about what that meant and how that might have affected their own history, their own families.
When I was reading this comment, it sounded like all lives matter type of a comment.
Well, I recently saw a sign that said, all lives matter. If all lives matter to you, then Black lives matter. So I think that that's an interesting point. Of course, all lives matter. But I think that by saying that and not acknowledging that Black lives have had, a harder road, then I think you're missing the point, really. I think too many people thought Black lives did not matter enough. So that's the problem.
Yeah, but comparing slavery with a free person's poverty itself seems to be more a very problematic construct to me there.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to do the equivalency discussion. Yeah. I mean, yes, everyone has had struggles. Many immigrants to this country have had struggles. My Italian grandfather came over with no money, with no language. He did not speak English. He just wanted a better life, and he managed to become, a successful. He had 4 sons, and he had a good life, but it was not an easy struggle for him. Many people have those kinds of stories in their family, and many people have advantages, and sometimes those advantages are because of the color of their skin.
Well, one of the things I hope that it gets as much focus is the Native Americans. I mean, thanks to the struggle of African American in our country, we continue to liberate ourselves from some part of the history, continue to learn, continue to bring those things. What happens to Native people who,
well, in New York,
knees on their neck? Where are those?
Well, yeah, in New York, in the Hudson Valley, many of them just were killed by disease brought by the settlers, and many of them moved. Some of the early history accounts that I've read have talked about fights and battles and massacres on both sides, and it's a pretty hard thing to read. I need to look more into that. There's one story of Isaac Collier having fought off an Indian attack. So a Native American attack. So I think that, there are stories of those early days in the early settling days when, the Native Americans, felt as if these new people were on their land and they didn't, care to have them there. And so they would attack. But I really, that history, if my early colonial history of my family is hard to find, finding information about Native Americans is that much harder. It's that much more buried.
You mentioned that there were some attempts in the Hudson Valley, if I remember correctly, to enslave Native people, but they escaped.
Right. The Native people didn't, they were pretty good at escaping. And then, the labor was also, part of the labor was indentured servitude, which came from, came from Holland or came from other countries in the old world. Those indentured servants sometimes survived and sometimes they died very, very young. The death rate of young boys who were serving as indentured servants was extremely high. So it didn't work out for the slave owners to try to do that too much.
So are you aware of some people who are looking into the history of, bringing it to life the way you have brought this part of the history to life? Is the Hudson Institute interested, which you mentioned, is preserving the part of that slave history in that area? Are they interested preserving the part of the Native American history in that area?
The Native American history, I don't really know. I mean, sometimes it's sort of siloed. Each group has their own specialty. But you raise a good question. I don't think there are other people who are writing about both slavery in New York and also doing it through a personal story and personal research. There are books, there are wonderful books about slavery in New York that talk about the history. There are wonderful books about the slave trade in Rhode Island, which are very powerful. And there's a wonderful book by a writer named Edward Ball, who writes about his Southern slave-owning family, Slaves in the Family, it's called. And his book won a National Book Award a few years back. So there have been narratives like that, but very few people have written that kind of narrative about the North. And that's my goal, is to write more about that.
There seems to be a level of silence if not necessarily a outright denial. On the other side as well, I mean, Eleanor grew up hearing, and I quote, there had never been an enslaved person in that branch of the family, unquote. As you're exploring, are you finding more and more of that? Or people don't want to look back into that, and it is of course a matter of pride for some, right?
Yes, and well, I think it's also the people I'm encountering. It's a little bit of a self-selected group because obviously these are people who are interested in doing research. But I thought that was one of the more interesting discoveries was that her grandmother, who Eleanor describes as a proper New England lady, very formal, very interested in education, felt that to acknowledge that there were enslaved people in this New York branch of the family was something that was not to be proud of. And so she denied it. And it was interesting too, because that branch of the family went on to be quite noted. James Vanderzee, who was a famous Harlem Renaissance photographer, whose photographs are in the Smithsonian today, was part of that branch of the family. So they have some wonderful people in that family. But, I think that, there are a lot of people even today that would rather not explore that history. They would rather move on from that. And I can understand that. Not everyone is interested in talking about how their ancestors might have suffered in a kind of a demeaning, degrading way. It's not a happy story.
Let's talk about Eleanor a little bit. I mean, your partner in search for the truth there. And when you try to approach in a odd way, she says, quote, I quote, you had nothing to do with it.
Yes.
To me, if you perpetuate the myth that slavery was not so bad, you should feel bad. Otherwise, there's nothing you could have done.
That's true. There was nothing I could have done to change history, but I do feel as if it is a kind of a reckoning, a reconciliation maybe. I struggle with the right word, but I do think it is part of my role now to tell the story. This is what I can do today, is tell the story. Not pass judgment on it necessarily in too many ways, but just to make sure people know is the most important thing I can do. Well, I do want to pass judgment because obviously slavery is wrong, but I don't feel personally guilty. I feel sort of horrified that my ancestors did this, but obviously I am just a descendant.
Were you comforted when you heard that? Did you cry when you heard that?
I was very moved. This was just a very powerful moment. I felt as if she and I could really work together when we started talking, because I realized that she is extremely open-minded, extremely interested in many, many things. She loves all sorts of history. And, we're always trading information and funny little stories. The other day I sent her a little text and I said, did you see that Sojourner Truth, who was, of course, a slave of a Dutch family in New York State, she's on the cover of this week's New Yorker magazine. And I sent her a note saying that. And she sent me back a picture, and she was a picture of a street sign that said Sojourner Truth Way. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And then she said, no, I stopped my car to read your text, and I looked up, and there was the Sojourner Truth Way sign. And I said, oh, she's calling to us. She wants to be part of our story. And that's actually an interesting point. We both feel as if the ancestors are calling to us and asking us to tell their stories. There's another wonderful story as well. I got one of my emails was from a novelist who lives in New York, who had created she writes historical fiction, and she had created a story around Mary Vanderzee's granddaughter, who was also named Mary Vanderzee, who was a seamstress in New York. And when she read my article, she screamed and woke up her husband because she couldn't believe that we had found the same person. So she and I have been exchanging emails too. So there have been some wonderful coincidences like that.
Was it a call of your journalist self, or was it a call of your heart when you got into this?
Both. I felt that, one of the things I love to do as a journalist is to pursue subjects that fascinate me. So I will write about things that have absolutely nothing to do with anything else, but are of interest to me. But this one has a deeper feeling to me. It resonates far more strongly with me. This is something that I feel this may be, one of my purposes to do is to write about this and to tell people why this story matters and why we need to learn from it. Not to sound too elevated. I mean, this is just a really good story as well.
Are you getting a lot of media interviews on this?
I'm hoping to. Yes, I'm getting emails every day. So stand by. We'll get more.
Okay, all right. So your relationship with Eleanor Meyer is a growing and ongoing relationship.
Yes.
And so what is in future?
Sorry?
What is in future?
Well, post-pandemic, I think we'll both go back to the Vetter Library in Coxsackie. Another interesting thing is that the owner of Mary Vanderzee's last home, where there's a photograph in the article of us standing on the porch of that home, we hadn't been inside because it was the new owner was in the process of moving in and she wasn't there. She has invited us back. So I thought we could go back, visit her home, see her home inside, and just spend some more time doing research in Coxsackie. We need to look in more cemeteries. We need to find more of her ancestors, find out where they're buried. Mary Vanderzee's father, who was the person I really featured in the story, but her father was a slave. We think he purchased property, and we think that his property is still standing today too. So we have all kinds of investigation like this to do. We want to know their stories. Their stories have been hidden for so long. It's important to tell their stories.
That story about that one of them getting some land, but racist attack drove them away. What is that one?
Her ancestor, we think it was Mary Vanderzee's husband, John Vanderzee, served in the War of 1812. And a lot of times soldiers were rewarded for military service by being given land. So apparently John Vanderzee was given land out west and never lived on it himself. He gave it to one of his sons. But when his son went to move there, he was driven away. I don't know the full extent of that story. But there was another story of one of Mary Vanderzee's sons, Thomas, who was a boatman on the Hudson River. And he was, I think, a captain of a boat. And he took that boat down to New York City and was immediately arrested because they assumed a black man driving a boat must have stolen the boat. So he was arrested and charged, and the owner of the boat had to come and get him out of jail because he was just unfairly accused. So there are lots of stories like that I need to do.
Well, that story continued to repeat itself. As you were saying about that, recently there was some black gentleman who was detained driving his own car.
Yes.
Because it was suspected that he's driving a stolen car.
Yes.
Just recently, I think last week or something, I saw some story of this nature. So do you think the history in some way continue to repeat itself?
It does. Which is part of the reason why we need to tell this story, to show that these foundations are strong foundations that we need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Now, it is such an educational article that it says education all over. But I was surprised that Washington Post has not added any further links to stories and resources to study further. Is it just their practice, or it is intentional? Because even the Hudson Valley, I have to Google it to go there to look at it, while you say they are doing that research. If this article was embedded with some more links or some resources are provided, there will be a whole lot of teachers who want to run with it, I would say.
No, that's a good point. I don't know why those things are not included. It's it's a news publication. It's not necessarily an educational publication. But there is a great site called Historic Hudson Valley that has some great resources for teachers that people can find, and resources and information about slavery. So I think, I think people can find it. It does take a little bit of digging, but I think schools more and more are starting to use this material. And I've been told even my article will be used in some classrooms in the Hudson Valley.
Oh, well, not only it will be used there. I'm thinking of Muslims in Chicago have about 30-day schools, and I'm thinking I have recommended to them. There is a book called by Sullivan Doof called "Servants of Allah." It focuses on slaves who were Muslims who struggled here in practice of their faith. Some of them actually were involved in slave rebellions as well. A fascinating book. So I got it into many textbooks in the reading. My daughter, who chose to be a teacher for a few years of English literature, she was using that book and some other people. So I think I'm going to recommend your article. And that's why I was saying that if it has some, Washington Post calling it a history lesson would have made it a little more helpful for other teachers who want to take it up.
Yeah, more on the lessons. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Debra, for being with us. I truly appreciate that. And I hope pretty soon you will be coming back to share a little more with us. Debra Bruno is a research, I was about to say research scholar, but journalist sometimes looks lower than what you have done. It's an amazing, fascinating story of discovering of truth, reliving the history and facing it. It's an insight which will help us deal with Black Lives Matter movement in a more honest manner. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you have been watching Muslim Network TV. And Muslim Network TV is always there on Galaxy 19 satellite, muslimnetwork.tv, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and a whole lot of social media. And I'm thankful to our producers, Sumaya Heather and Aliza Majid. Thank you so much. Peace. Salam.